The mercenary's call, Hook. Kane stood alone, staring at the ruined city below him. The once bustling metropolis was now a graveyard of crumbled buildings, broken roads, and burning wreckage. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying the scent of ash and smoke. His boots crunched on the dirt beneath him as he moved forward, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape. It had been years since he felt anything like fear, but today was different. Today, something was waiting for him, something far worse than any enemy he had ever faced. His communication device buzzed to life, breaking the silence. Kane didn't flinch. He had been expecting this. Slowly, he pulled the device from his belt, his fingers brushing over the worn edges as he activated it. The screen flickered, and a distorted voice came through. "Kane, do you hear me?" The voice crackled, sharp and demanding. Kane narrowed his eyes. He recognized the voice. It was General Marks, the commander who had hired him for countless dangerous missions over the years. But this time, the tone in Mark's voice was different. It was urgent. It was almost desperate. "I'm here," Kane replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the tension he felt building inside him. "Good," Marks said quickly. "You need to listen carefully. We've lost contact with a group of human survivors on Tali Prime. They're important, too important to lose." Kane's pulse quickened. Survivors? He hadn't been briefed on any survivors. Tali Prime was a war zone, the site of a brutal alien invasion. Most of humanity's last strongholds had already fallen, and the survivors scattered. Why had he been sent here? Survivors. Kane repeated, confusion flickering in his eyes. What makes them so important? There was a pause on the other end. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken weight. Finally, General Marks spoke again, his voice lower now, more serious. "They hold information that could turn the tide of this war," Marks said. "They know something the aliens want to keep secret. You're the only one who can get to them before the enemy does." Kane's grip on the device tightened, and a dark thought crossed his mind. He had seen how the aliens worked, how they hunted humans like animals, erasing any trace of rebellion or resistance. But this was different. He had heard whispers about key survivors who held valuable intelligence. Could this be the break humanity needed? He glanced around the ruins again. Every corner of Tali Prime seemed to hide an enemy, a threat waiting to strike. His mind raced as he considered the risks. But he was a mercenary. Risk was what he did. "Understood," Kane said, pushing aside any hesitation. "I'll find them." "Time is running out," Marks warned. "The aliens are closing in fast. You have to move quickly. No mistakes, Kane. We can't afford to lose them. You must get them to safety." The transmission cut off abruptly. Kane stood there, his face expressionless, but his mind whirling. The mission was clear now. Find the survivors, protect them, and get them to safety. But there was more to this than just a simple rescue mission. Whatever these survivors knew, it was vital. His boots scraped against the dirt as he began to move, setting his path toward the heart of Tali Prime. He had trained for years, fought countless battles, and survived things no one else could. But this time, it felt different. This time, the weight of humanity's future seemed to rest squarely on his shoulders. The city around him was silent, almost eerily so. The buildings loomed over him like silent sentinels, their dark windows watching him with an almost unnatural stillness. Kane's senses were on high alert. Every step was measured, every sound amplified in his mind. He was used to operating alone, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. A loud explosion shattered the silence in the distance, followed by the harsh crackling of gunfire. Kane paused for a moment, listening. The battle was still raging here, even if he couldn't see it. The war was everywhere now. There was no safe place. Only a few miles away, the survivors were waiting for him, but every step toward them was fraught with danger. Kane pressed forward, his body moving on instinct. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of movement in the shadows. His mind was focused on the mission, but his gut told him something wasn't right. The aliens had to know he was coming. They always did. He rounded a corner and found himself face to face with a set of dilapidated buildings. The sound of clanging metal and hissing machinery echoed from inside. Kane quickly ducked behind a nearby wall, crouching low and peering through a crack in the concrete. There, in the distance, he saw the unmistakable forms of alien patrols, large, armored figures, heavily armed, scanning the streets for any signs of life. His heart rate quickened. The aliens were closer than he thought. They were already sweeping the area, and if they found the survivors first, this mission would be over before it even started. Kane's hand instinctively reached for the blaster holstered at his side, but he held back. No, he needed to be smart. The element of surprise was his best weapon. Charging in headfirst would only guarantee failure. His mind shifted back to the survivors. They were the key. If he could just get to them before the aliens did, everything could change. The clock was ticking. The first encounter. Kane moved through the streets of Tali Prime with careful precision, his every step calculated. His mind was focused, but his instincts were on high alert. The silence of the city felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. Every time the wind howled through the shattered buildings, Kane felt his skin prickle. It was as if the air itself carried the weight of something ancient and dangerous. He could hear the alien patrols up ahead, their heavy boots echoing against the cracked pavement. These were the Kyrex, humanoid, but far taller and stronger than any human. Their armor was black as night, and their weapons glowed with an eerie electric hum. Kane had encountered them before in battle, and he knew how deadly they could be. No mercy, no hesitation, just destruction. He crouched behind a rusted vehicle, trying to blend into the shadows. His breathing slowed, his senses sharpened. The patrol moved past him without noticing, the clatter of their footsteps fading into the distance. Kane exhaled, a small victory. But it wouldn't last. The aliens knew they were out there somewhere. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. He had to find the survivors before the Kyrex did. As he advanced through the narrow alleyways, something caught his attention, an old half-collapsed building that hadn't yet been demolished. His gut told him something wasn't right about it. The structure was too intact, too quiet. He approached cautiously, his boots making almost no sound as he moved. Inside, it was dark, only a faint glow from the distant fires outside illuminating the dusty air. The building had once been a hub of commerce, but now it was a graveyard of broken windows, overturned crates, and forgotten debris. Kane moved deeper into the ruins, his eyes scanning every corner. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his composure. Every sense was alert. A flicker of movement in the shadows caught his eye. He froze, his hand reaching for the blaster at his side. There, in the darkness, a figure emerged from behind a stack of fallen debris. Kane's fingers tightened around the weapon, but then he stopped himself. The figure wasn't Kyrex, it was human. A woman. She stepped forward, her face partially obscured by a hood, but Kane could see the exhaustion and fear in her eyes. She looked no older than 25, with a scrappy, survivalist air about her. Her clothes were ragged, patched together from whatever she could find. She moved with purpose, yet there was an underlying tension in her every step, like a wounded animal, always on edge. "Who are you?" Kane's voice was low, careful, betraying none of his surprise. The woman stiffened but didn't pull a weapon. She seemed cautious, calculating but not aggressive. Her eyes flicked to Kane's blaster before meeting his gaze. "You're the mercenary, aren't you?" she asked, her voice raspy from days of barely speaking. There was a note of disbelief in her voice, as if she hadn't expected anyone to come at all. Kane didn't lower his weapon, but he relaxed just a bit. "I'm looking for the survivors. Are you one of them?" The woman hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "I might be," she said finally, "but you're too late. They already found us." His heart skipped a beat. The Kyrex. Had they already captured the others? Who? The aliens? Kane pressed, trying to keep his voice steady. She nodded, a grim look crossing her face. They've been hunting us for days. We're the last ones left. You're our only hope. Kane didn't know whether to believe her or not. He had been lied to before, by enemies and by allies alike. But her fear seemed real, and that gave her words weight. Where are the others? He asked, his mind already racing with possibilities. If the aliens had them, there was little hope of saving them. The Kyrex were brutal when it came to human prisoners. The woman looked away, her gaze falling to the ground as if she couldn't bear to meet his eyes. They took them, the others. We were supposed to be evacuated, but something went wrong. The aliens set a trap, and we fell for it. Kane cursed under his breath. Every mission felt like this: 1 step forward, 3 steps back. The survivors had been bait in a trap, and now he was the one walking into it. But not all is lost, the woman continued, her voice gaining strength. There's a safe house. It's hidden, and it's the only place we can go now. If you can help me get there, maybe we can survive long enough to escape this nightmare. Kane considered her words. He didn't trust easily, especially not in a war like this, where betrayal could be deadly. But something about her made him believe. The determination in her eyes, the desperation, she wasn't lying. "What's your name?" he asked, still skeptical, but willing to listen. "Lena," she replied, "and if you want to save the others, you'll follow me, quickly." Without waiting for a response, Lena turned and headed toward a narrow alley, her movements swift and sure. Kane stood there for a moment, contemplating the situation. He was alone, vulnerable, and there was no guarantee that this woman was leading him to safety. But he had no choice. The mission came first, and if he was going to find the survivors, he had to trust her for now. Kane followed her, his every sense alert, ready for the next danger that would surely come. The Kyrex were still out there, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. Lena glanced back over her shoulder as they moved, her eyes searching the shadows. "You're not the only one who's been hunted," she said quietly. "The Kyrex have something planned for humanity, something worse than you can imagine." Kane felt the weight of her words sink into him. Whatever this was, it was bigger than just a simple rescue mission. This was something far more dangerous, and it was just the beginning. The unexpected ally. The alleyways of Tally Prime twisted and turned like a labyrinth, each corner hiding a potential threat. Kane kept his hand on his blaster, eyes constantly scanning for any sign of movement. Lena led the way, her steps quick but silent. The narrow passageways offered little cover, but she moved as though she knew the city's every secret, as though she had lived in its ruins for years. Kane couldn't help but admire her composure. In a world where everything seemed on the verge of collapse, she exuded a calm that was almost unnerving. They moved swiftly, avoiding the larger streets where alien patrols were more likely to be. But Kane knew it wouldn't be long before they were discovered. The Kyrex were relentless hunters, and their technology was far superior to anything humanity had left. If they were still out there, and he was sure they would be tracking every movement. Lena glanced over her shoulder, her eyes flicking to Kane for just a moment before she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're close now. The safe house is just up ahead." Kane nodded, but his mind was racing. Something about the way she said it felt off, like she wasn't telling him the full truth. He had learned over the years that survival often depended on trusting your instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling him that this safe house might not be what it seemed. Still, there was no time for second-guessing. The survivors, the intel, the war, all of it depended on what came next. Kane couldn't afford to hesitate. They rounded a corner and entered another narrow street, this one lined with tall, broken structures that seemed to lean inwards, as though the city itself was about to crumble under the weight of its history. The air was thick with dust, and the distant sounds of battle echoed through the cracks in the walls. It felt like they were walking through the bones of the dead city. Lena stopped in front of a rusted door, hidden in the shadow of a collapsed building. She turned to Kane, her face grim but resolute. "This is it," she said. "Inside, you'll find the others, but be careful. The Kyrics have infiltrated more than just the streets. They have eyes everywhere." Kane looked at the door. It was old and worn, but it wasn't the condition of the building that concerned him. It was the way Lena had said careful, as if there was something else lurking inside, something beyond just the survivors. "I'll handle it," Kane said, his voice low. Lena stepped aside, allowing him to approach the door. He reached for the handle but paused. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled, a warning he had learned to trust. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open slowly, stepping into the darkened interior. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale sweat and the faint scent of burning incense. The survivors were there, huddled in the far corner, their faces tired and worn. But as Kane's eyes scanned the room, he noticed something that didn't sit right. There were no weapons in sight, no signs of anyone preparing for a fight. The survivors were sitting quietly, almost too quietly, as though they had already given up. Kane's suspicion deepened, and he instinctively reached for his blaster again. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Where's the rest of your group?" The leader of the survivors, a man with graying hair and a gaunt face, slowly stood up from the corner. His eyes were hollow, his movements slow, as if he hadn't had a decent night's sleep in weeks. "You've come to rescue us," he said, his voice distant, as though speaking from a dream. "We thought it was too late, but you're here. You're our last chance." Kane's eyes narrowed. "What's really going on here?" He glanced at Lena, but she was standing still, her gaze fixed on the survivors. She wasn't moving to reassure him or to answer his questions. The man's voice cracked, and he took a step forward, his face filled with an odd mixture of hope and despair. "The Kyrics have been watching us for weeks. They know everything. But we have something they need. They'd promised to let us go, if we just gave it to them." His voice trailed off as he looked around the room, as if searching for something he couldn't find. Kane felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. These people hadn't been rescued, they had been trapped. "Something they need," Kane repeated, his voice growing colder. "What is it? What did you give them?" The man's eyes flickered to the ground. "I don't know, it was a device. Something the Kyrics wanted. We thought it was just a piece of tech, a way to get out of here. But now they've taken everything we had, and they won't stop until they get it all." Lena stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "They don't know what they're dealing with," she said, her voice sharp. "But I do." Kane turned to her, his heart racing. "You knew." Lena's eyes met his, and for the first time since he had met her, Kane saw something other than fear or determination in her gaze. There was something darker, something hidden. "I've been trying to stop this for years," she said, her voice cold. "The Kyrics, they're not just invaders, they're manipulators. The device they want isn't just technology, it's a weapon. A weapon that could end the war in an instant, a weapon that could destroy humanity." Kane's mind reeled. He had been so focused on saving the survivors that he hadn't even considered the bigger picture. But now it was clear. This wasn't just about a group of people. It was about a weapon, and the Kyrics were willing to do anything to get it. Lena's expression softened slightly, but there was no warmth in her eyes, only resolve. "The only way to stop them is to destroy it. But we can't do it alone. We need to work together, if you trust me, that is." Kane looked at her, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the mission settle on his shoulders. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about fighting back. The battle for humanity had just begun, and it would take everything he had to win it. "Let's get to work," Kane said, his voice hardening. The war had only just begun. The bait. The walls of the safe house felt closer now, suffocating even. Kane's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the puzzle. The survivors had been bait, nothing more. They had believed in the lies the Kyrics told them. And now the aliens were tightening the noose. But the true danger wasn't in the streets or the alien patrols, it was in the weapon. The weapon that could wipe out everything, humanity's final hope, or its final destruction. Lena stood by the doorway, her eyes focused on the map pinned to the wall. She was calm now, but there was an edge to her, the same edge Kane had seen in her earlier, when she spoke of the Kyrex, the edge that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Kane studied her for a moment. "You didn't just bring me here to rescue a few survivors, did you?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Lena didn't turn, but the muscles in her back tensed. "No," she said quietly. "I brought you here because you're the only one who can help me destroy it. The Kyrex will stop at nothing to get their hands on it, and if they do..." She trailed off, her words hanging in the air like an unspoken curse. Kane's eyes narrowed. "What is it, really? This weapon, what does it do?" She glanced at him then, her eyes sharp. "I can't explain everything. Not yet, but it's worse than you think. The Kyrex have been experimenting with human DNA, trying to create a weapon that can control minds, manipulate entire populations. The device they're after isn't just a tool, it's a key to unlocking a terrifying new power. They've been working on it for years, and now they're close to finishing it." Kane clenched his fists. And the survivors, what do they have to do with all this? Lena's lips tightened, but she answered. The device was hidden within the survivors' ranks. They didn't know it at first, but the Kyrex knew. They infiltrated their ranks and planted the key without their knowledge. The survivors thought it was just a piece of tech, a small fragment from the wreckage. But it's the core of the weapon, the key to the Kyrex control. Kane took a deep breath, trying to process what she had just said. He had seen the devastation the aliens had caused firsthand, but this was different. This wasn't just a war for land or resources. This was a war for humanity's very soul. "Where is it now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rising tension in his chest. Lena hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to the survivors gathered in the corner. The Kyrex already know. They're coming for it, and they'll stop at nothing to get it back. Kane's heart sank. The aliens were always one step ahead, and now it seemed they had the upper hand. His gut twisted with the realization that this wasn't just about fighting the Kyrex anymore. It was about preventing them from controlling humanity. "We don't have time," Kane said, his voice sharp. "We need to move. Now." Lena nodded, but there was a hesitation in her eyes. She glanced at the map again, her finger tracing a route. "I know. There's an old research facility not far from here. It's heavily guarded, but it's where the Kyrex are holding the device. If we can infiltrate the facility and destroy the weapon before they can activate it, we have a chance." Kane didn't need any more convincing. He didn't care about the odds. The mission was clear, and time was running out. He had lost too many people to the Kyrex already, and he wasn't about to let their twisted experiment become humanity's final doom. But as they prepared to leave the safe house, something shifted in the air. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble faintly, a vibration that made the hairs on the back of Kane's neck stand up. He motioned for Lena to stop, his eyes scanning the room. "What is it?" he asked. Lena's face went pale. "The Kyrex are here. They found us." A low rumble echoed through the walls, followed by the sharp sound of metal scraping against concrete. Kane moved quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for his blaster. There was no time to waste. The survivors were already gathering their things, but their panic was palpable. The Kyrex had caught wind of their hideout, and it wouldn't be long before the whole facility was under siege. Kane moved to the door, his mind racing. The safe house was no longer safe, and they had to move now. "We're taking the back exit," he said, his voice firm. "Keep low, stay quiet." Lena followed without hesitation, her eyes hard with determination. She had known this would happen. She had known all along that the Kyrex would come for them. But the true weight of the situation hit Kane with full force now. They weren't just being hunted for their lives, they were being hunted for the weapon that could turn the tide of the war. They moved through the narrow hallway, every step shadowed by the growing sounds of the Kyrex forces approaching. The building shook with the impact of something heavy, something powerful. The aliens were here. As they reached the back exit, Kane pushed open the door and stepped out into the ruins of Tali Prime once more. The streets were eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, but Kane knew it wouldn't be for long. The Kyrex would be all around them soon, and they would have to fight their way through if they were to make it to the research facility in time. Lena turned to Kane, her voice low but urgent. "We don't have much time. The facility is heavily guarded, but there's a weakness in the security system. We can slip through, but only if we move fast." Kane nodded. "Lead the way. I'll cover you." And just like that, the quiet of the ruins was broken by the deafening sound of alien engines overhead. The Kyrex were closing in. The real fight was about to begin. But Kane was ready. This was no longer just about survival. This was about fighting back, about stopping the Kyrex from unleashing a weapon that could destroy everything humanity had ever fought for. The bait had been set. Now it was time to turn the tables. The shadow's edge. The streets of Tali Prime seemed to stretch endlessly before Kane, every shadow hiding a threat, every broken building a possible ambush. The city had been abandoned long ago, but in the silence it was clear. This place was still alive, pulsing with danger. The Kyrex were here, watching, waiting, and Kane knew that time was running out. Lena led the way, her movements quick and purposeful. Kane stayed close behind, his senses razor-sharp. The map she had shown him was a blur in his mind, but he didn't need it now. His instincts guided him. He had been through enough battles to know the importance of reading the battlefield. Every street, every alley could be a trap. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. Not just the lives of the survivors, but the entire future of humanity. The research facility was close now, a hulking structure half buried in the ruins of the city. A few weeks ago, it had been a hidden military installation, a place of secrets and experiments. Now it was a fortress overrun by the Kyrex. The building loomed over them, its dark metal walls reflecting the faint light of a distant, burning horizon. Lena turned to Kane, her face tense. "We need to split up. The Kyrex are watching all the main entrances. If we go in through the front, we'll be walking straight into their hands. I'll distract them. You find the device." Kane didn't like it. Dividing forces in enemy territory always led to complications, but Lena's eyes were hard with resolve. She had a plan, and there was no time to argue. He didn't know if he trusted her completely, but in this war, trust was a luxury no one could afford. "Fine," he said, his voice steady. "But be careful. You're not the only one who's a target now." Lena gave a small, fleeting smile, a rare moment of humanity amid the chaos. "Same to you. I'll be fine. We have to be. We don't get another shot at this." Kane nodded and then slipped into the shadows, moving toward the side of the facility. His steps were silent, his every movement calculated. The Kyrex were meticulous in their patrols, but that arrogance had a weakness: complacency. They had underestimated humanity for too long. Kane would make sure they pay for that mistake. As he neared a side entrance, he paused, crouching behind a crumbled column. The facility was heavily guarded. The Kyrex had fortified the perimeter with drones, mechanical sentries, and alien soldiers. Kane's sharp eyes scanned the guards' patrol routes, slow, methodical, predictable. He would have to move quickly before the next wave of patrols came around. His heart rate slowed, his focus narrowing. He had always been good at sneaking in and out of enemy territory, but this felt different. The weight of the mission pressed against his chest, tightening with each step he took. He had no illusions about what was at stake. The device wasn't just a weapon, it was a key to humanity's survival, or its destruction. Kane waited for the right moment, timing his move to coincide with the shift change in the guard's routine. With a swift, fluid motion, he darted toward the entrance, slipping inside undetected. The inside of the facility was dark, sterile, and cold. The walls were lined with strange, alien symbols that Kane couldn't read, but he knew their significance. They were part of the Kyrex's twisted technology, symbols that marked their influence in every corner of the galaxy. The corridors were eerily quiet, and the only sound was the hum of alien machines, which filled the space with a sense of urgency. Kane could feel the presence of the Kyrex, even if they weren't immediately visible. The walls were closing in. He had to hurry. He crept through the dark halls, following the faint hum of a generator in the distance. Every instinct screamed at him to move faster, but he knew that haste would be his undoing. His breathing was slow and controlled, his steps light. The Kyrex were good, but they couldn't be everywhere. Finally, he reached the central chamber. The door was heavily reinforced, but the lock was a simple code that a trained mercenary like Kane could bypass in seconds. He had no idea what lay beyond that door, but he had an unsettling feeling in his gut. The air in the hallway grew thicker, and the silence felt suffocating. He could almost hear the whispers of the Kyrex, as if they knew he was here. With a deep breath, Kane opened the door. What he saw inside almost made him freeze in his tracks. The device. It wasn't what he had imagined. It wasn't a simple piece of tech, a weapon, or a machine. It was a collection of organic matter, fused with alien technology, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and metal, a nightmare in motion. The device pulsed faintly, as though it were alive. The room was filled with a low, thrumming hum that seemed to reverberate deep in Kane's chest, making his heart beat in sync with it. The Kyrex had merged their technology with human DNA. This was the result. And if it activated, if it fell into their hands, humanity wouldn't just lose the war. It would lose everything. Kane's eyes widened in disbelief. This wasn't just a weapon. It was an abomination. He could feel the weight of the Kyrex's twisted experimentation pressing on him. This wasn't just about taking back land or resources. It was about humanity's very identity. He stepped closer, his fingers brushing the cold surface of the device. His mind raced, trying to process everything. He knew what had to be done. He had to destroy it. But how? The device was too complex, too deeply integrated into the facility's systems. One wrong move, and the whole place would be on alert. The Kyrex would swarm. But then he remembered what Lena had said. There was a weakness in their security. He glanced around the room, searching for any clue, anything that might help him. His gaze landed on a series of wires running along the walls, connected to an array of strange alien consoles. A control panel. He could disable the power, overload the system, and hopefully destroy the device in the process. His hand hovered over the control panel, the pulse of the device still beating in his chest. He didn't have much time. The Kyrex would be here soon. Kane took a breath, knowing the next move would determine everything. He pressed the button. The lights flickered, the hum grew louder, and the walls began to tremble. A voice echoed through the facility, cold and mechanical. Warning. Security breach detected. Kyrex forces deploying. Kane didn't have to look up to know that the Kyrex were coming. The countdown had begun. The fight had only just started. The storm unleashed. The alarms blared, their shrill sound reverberating through the halls like 1,000 screams. Red lights flashed overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. Kane's heart pounded in his chest, a steady rhythm of adrenaline. He could feel the weight of the seconds slipping away, each one pulling him deeper into danger. The Kyrex were coming, and they were coming fast. His hand hovered over the control panel, his mind racing. The device was still pulsing, that sickly, rhythmic beat that seemed to echo through his very bones. The walls were closing in. The entire facility was designed to defend this single thing, this abomination that could destroy humanity itself. Kane ripped his eyes away from the control panel and took a deep breath. He couldn't afford to waste time. If he didn't disable the facility's power grid, the Kyrex would soon swarm the room, and the device would be activated. But the damage was already done. The countdown had begun. Now, it was a matter of survival. He dashed across the room, his boots echoing off the cold, metallic floor. The facility was alive with the sound of rushing feet, the Kyrex closing in on him. He could feel them, even though they weren't visible yet. Their presence was suffocating, that energy crackling in the air like an electric storm. As Kane reached the back of the chamber, he spotted the control room, the heart of the facility's power grid. The room was sealed off, guarded by 2 Kyrex soldiers who were scanning the area. They hadn't noticed him yet. Kane crouched, slipping into the shadows. He was already at a disadvantage. He was alone, and the Kyrex were always more numerous, more lethal. But Kane had something they didn't: experience. Years of combat, of surviving against overwhelming odds, had honed his senses to razor sharpness. He took a moment to steady his breathing. The 2 Kyrex soldiers were speaking in their guttural, alien language, their voices low but urgent. One of them seemed distracted, looking over the control panel's schematics. The other paced, checking the monitors. This was it. Kane couldn't afford to wait any longer. He reached into his belt, pulling out a small, silent dart launcher, a tool he had perfected over years of service. One quick shot, and the soldiers would be down, silently and swiftly. With a quick exhale, Kane aimed for the soldier on the left. His aim was steady, his pulse steady. He fired. The dart hit its mark, the soldier's head snapping back as the tranquilizer took hold. Before the second soldier could react, Kane darted from the shadows, closing the distance in seconds. A swift blow to the back of the neck sent him crumpling to the floor. Kane didn't waste a second. He slid into the control room, moving quickly to the main power grid. The alarms blared louder now, a relentless reminder of the ticking clock. His fingers danced over the alien control panels, reading the symbols, deciphering them with a practiced eye. He knew the system well, every code, every protocol. This wasn't his first time hacking into Kyrex technology. He found the main power conduit, the central hub of the facility's defenses. If he could overload it, the whole system would collapse. It would take out the device, the security, and the Kyrex's control over this place. His fingers hesitated over the final sequence. One wrong move, and the facility would go into full lockdown. The Kyrex would know exactly where he was. But Kane was betting on a small opening in their security, something Lena had mentioned earlier. The Kyrex had underestimated their ability to manipulate their own systems. He hit the override. For a moment, there was nothing, just the hum of the failing power grid. Then the facility shuddered, and everything went dark. The lights flickered out and the alarms stopped, leaving only an eerie silence. Kane's breath hitched. He knew what was coming. The ground trembled beneath him as the walls began to vibrate with the force of the Kyrex's retaliation. The lights flashed back on, red, urgent, flickering with the unstable energy of the system, and that's when he heard it, the sound of doors opening, of Kyrex soldiers moving into the corridors. They knew. The countdown had reached critical levels. The Kyrex weren't just going to fight him, they were going to wipe him out. Kane didn't waste another second. He sprinted toward the back exit, his mind a blur of calculations. The Kyrex would have reinforcements pouring in from all sides. He had to get out. He had to get to Lena. The halls were a maze now, twisted, chaotic. The Kyrex had already begun locking down every escape route. Kane could hear the faint thrum of alien engines echoing through the facility's walls. They were on the move. They knew where he was. He darted into a side corridor, scanning for an exit, when a door ahead of him hissed open. He barely had time to react as the first Kyrex soldier emerged from the shadows, their weapon raised. Kane moved instinctively, diving to the side, narrowly dodging the deadly plasma shot that burned through the air where his head had been just a moment before. He fired back, his blaster taking down the soldier with one clean shot. But there were more coming. He could hear their footfalls growing louder, closer. A whole platoon of Kyrex soldiers would be on him in seconds. Kane cursed under his breath. The room ahead was the only way out. He rushed toward it, but just as he reached the door, another wave of soldiers blocked the exit. The Kyrics were closing in on him. He had no choice but to fight his way through. The device, his mission, was still at the forefront of his mind, but there was something else now, a fire in his chest that burned hotter than the danger. He wasn't just fighting for the device anymore. He was fighting to win this war, for humanity's survival. And he wasn't going to let the Kyrics take it from him. With a roar, Kane raised his blaster and charged toward the advancing soldiers, his mind focused, his body moving on instinct. The storm had come, and Kane was ready to face it head-on. The battle for humanity's future was about to reach its bloody climax. The last stand. The air crackled with tension as Kane faced the Kyric soldiers. The facility's lights flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the cold walls. His blaster hummed in his grip, his pulse steady despite the overwhelming odds. He had fought many battles in his life, but this was different. This was the endgame. The Kyrics had their claws in humanity's throat, and if he failed, everything he fought for, everything they'd fought for, would be lost. The Kyric soldiers advanced, their movements precise, calculating. Their alien armor glinted in the dim light, their weapons drawn, ready to strike. Kane could hear their guttural growls, that alien language vibrating the air around him. But his focus was unshakable. His mind raced, analyzing, calculating, weighing every move. He had only one shot, one chance to make this right. There was no time for hesitation. Kane fired first, his blaster shots quick and accurate. One Kyric soldier dropped to the floor, a clean shot through the chest. But the others were closing in, and they were relentless. Their plasma rifles hummed, charging for the kill. Kane dove behind a steel pillar, narrowly avoiding a burst of alien fire. His heart pounded in his chest, but his focus was razor-sharp. He couldn't afford to lose control now. He popped out from behind the pillar, returning fire. Another soldier fell, but the remaining Kyrics kept coming, their eyes glowing with unnatural determination. They weren't just soldiers, they were hunters, and Kane was their prey. But he wasn't done yet. A voice crackled in his earpiece. "Kane, we've got a problem." It was Lena's voice, urgent, filled with static. "Kane," she repeated, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The facility's about to self-destruct. You need to get out of there now." Kane's blood ran cold. Self-destruct? He glanced at the console in the center of the room. The countdown was already flashing red, ticking down with horrifying precision. "How long?" Kane asked, his voice tight. 5 minutes, Lena replied. "You have 5 minutes before this whole place goes up in flames." His stomach dropped. That was the Kyrics' plan. Destroy everything before Kane could get out, take the device with them, and make sure humanity couldn't use it against them. The clock was ticking, and the Kyrics were only moments away from sealing his fate. "I'm almost done here," he said. "Just keep the exit clear." Kane moved quickly, his pulse quickening. The Kyric soldiers were closing in. Their heavy steps echoed through the hall, their weapons raised, ready to fire. He couldn't let them get any closer. He couldn't let them stop him now. He sprinted toward the control room, firing as he went, the heat of the plasma shots grazing his skin. He needed to reach the core, the power core that controlled the facility's self-destruct sequence. If he could disable it, he could stop the countdown and buy them more time to escape. But it wouldn't be easy. The Kyrics would be on him in seconds. He reached the door to the control room, and before he could open it, a massive Kyric soldier emerged from the shadows, a hulking figure with glowing eyes and a weapon far larger than any Kane had ever seen. The soldier raised his rifle and fired. Kane barely had time to react. He dove to the side, the plasma shot whizzing past him, burning a hole through the wall. His heart raced as he scrambled for cover, his mind working faster than his body. The Kyric soldier advanced, relentless, its gun aimed at Kane's chest. But Kane had been trained for this. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a survivor, and he knew how to fight back. With a roar, he rolled to the side, Coming up on one knee, his blaster aimed directly at the soldier's weak spot, a small joint in its armor just beneath the shoulder. He fired. The Kyrex soldier jerked back, a spray of black blood erupting from the wound. It crumpled to the floor with a heavy thud. But there was no time to revel in the victory. The rest of the Kyrex was still coming. Kane's hand flew to his earpiece. "Lena, I'm at the control room. Get ready, we're not out of this yet." "I'm on my way," she said, her voice steady. "Just hold them off." Kane pushed through the door to the control room. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with alien consoles and blinking lights. He saw the main power conduit, right in the center, the heart of the facility's self-destruct sequence. The countdown was ticking, the numbers flashing faster than ever. 3 minutes, 2 minutes. Kane didn't hesitate. He moved to the control panel and punched in a series of commands. The symbols were alien, unfamiliar, but he'd studied enough Kyrex tech in his time as a mercenary to understand the basics. He needed to disable the power grid, override the countdown. He couldn't afford to waste time. His fingers flew across the console, punching in sequences of numbers. The walls around him seemed to close in as the pressure mounted, the sound of the Kyrex soldiers growing louder, closer. He could almost hear their heavy footsteps pounding down the hall, their weapons charging, ready for the kill. One wrong move, and it was over. But just as he was about to finalize the sequence, the room shook violently. The door slammed open, and a fresh wave of Kyrex soldiers poured in. Kane spun around, his blaster up, taking down the first soldier in his sights. But there were too many. He couldn't hold them off alone. The countdown hit 1 minute. "Damn it," Kane swore. There was no time. He reached for the self-destruct switch, and with a final, desperate pull, he yanked the lever. Sparks flew, and the lights flickered wildly, casting an ominous red glow over the room. The countdown stopped. The facility was no longer on a timer. But the Kyrex were closing in fast, and Kane knew there was only one way out. He activated the emergency override, opening a hatch in the floor. Beneath him, he could see the escape tunnel leading down into the depths of the planet's core, a passage that led far away from the facility, far away from the Kyrex. "Kane, we're ready." Lena's voice came through his earpiece again. Kane didn't waste another second. He dived into the escape tunnel just as the Kyrex soldiers burst into the room, their weapons raised, their eyes filled with fury. The hatch slammed shut behind him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kane allowed himself a single breath of relief. The facility had been stopped. The Kyrex's weapon was destroyed, and humanity had one more chance to fight. But Kane knew the war was far from over. This was just the beginning. And as the tunnels below the planet shifted and groaned, he pushed forward, knowing that whatever came next, he was ready. The final battle had only just begun.